Having covered some of the bottom-up and top-down controls over trophic dynamics, we're now going to take a look at some of the factors that regulate the amount of energy and materials that flows through some of the different compartments. Here, we'll look at ecological efficiencies. Another way to think of this is to ask yourself, why do men spend so much time fishing? And this isn't about differences between men and women, but it does seem like when you go to a lake, there's a lot more fish in the lake than if you were to go to, say, a forest and think about the herbivore biomass that's in a forest. It just seems like lakes are fundamentally different than forests in their ability to produce herbivores and carnivores. So in this case, it's something that we understand relatively well. Men spend a lot more time fishing than they do hunting, but why is that? And this might be something that ecosystem ecology can help us start to understand. Energy loss with each trophic transfer limits the production of higher trophic levels. We know that not all biomass is consumed, but also not all biomass is digested. And when we think about the relative sizes of plant pools and herbivore pools, the first question is, in determining how much herbivore there is how much of this plant pool is going to get consumed. And then what happens to it once it's in the herbivore, and how much of that energy goes in to helping maintain herbivores versus produce new biomass, or is going to be lost through other pathways. So if you take a look at the fecal samples of different organisms and say something like horses, that there's actually a lot of recognizable plant material that's present in there. In this case, they seem to be relatively inefficient in taking this plant biomass and using it to produce biomass. It passes through the system relatively undigested. Now, this isn't necessarily to mean that they're evolutionally poorly adapted. Often these fibrous materials that make it through a digestive system of horses, for example, are of relatively low nutritional quality. And horses can pass the bad stuff and digest the good stuff. But it's just a point to show you that there are differences in efficiencies by which energy that enters into the herbivore is turned into actual biomass or used for maintenance. Another thing to think about is that herbivores respire. And so if we were to take a look at plants and take a look at energy flow into herbivores, some of that energy is used to produce new herbivore biomass. Some of it is lost if it's not digested, and some of it is lost because of respiration. And different organisms respire at different rates, and that can also contribute to how much herbivore biomass that you have. If an organism is respiring at a relatively fast rate, that might actually shrink how much herbivore biomass you can maintain on a landscape. In general, we're going to talk about trophic efficiency here. So we're going to take a look at the efficiency by which energy and materials makes it from one trophic level to the next. And a real simple equation shows that you can break down the trophic efficiency, so the amount of energy that's present at one trophic level versus the next trophic level, based on efficiency of consumption, efficiency of assimilation, and the efficiency of production. And I'll go through each one of these in just a minute. Here we're going to use a simple diagram to show the differences between or among consumption efficiency, assimilation efficiency, and production efficiency. Noting that the trophic efficiency is going to be the product of these three different efficiencies, and is defined as the amount of production that we have at one trophic level versus the one below it. So essentially it's the ratio of herbivores to plants if we're thinking about that portion of the food chain. Consumption efficiency is the amount of material that's ingested at a given level versus the amount that's produced at the level below it. So in this case, we're simply taking a look at the fraction of plants that's eaten versus that portion which is not and might enter the detrital web. So here's our herbivore, and a certain fraction of NPP, for example, is consumed by herbivores, and a certain fraction is not. And that ratio of how much biomass is ingested to how much is produced at the level below it is called consumption efficiency. In a diagram here, you have the amount of production that we have at a given level, say the first level, this would be primary production. There's a fraction that's not consumed, and there's a fraction that's consumed. And that consumption efficiency is really the ratio of how much is ingested versus produced. So that's the first efficiency that we have to think about when we're thinking about how much herbivore there is, how much of that material, plant material for example, is actually eaten. After that, we have to think about assimilation efficiency. Assimilation efficiency is essentially how much of the material that enters an herbivore is lost through through defecation, for example, and how much of it is actually incorporated or brought into the bloodstream. In that case, that's a different ratio. So we have A sub n over I sub n. I sub n is the amount of material that's ingested, and this is basically how much energy there is available for assimilation. So that's the second ratio. It's the efficiency by which material that's ingested is actually made available for productive purposes. And lastly, we're going to have the production efficiency, E sub PROD, E of production, which is the ratio of animal production to the amount of energy that's actually digested. And in that case, we're basically just taking out the respiratory component of it. So you have a certain amount of energy that's available for production. Some of that's going to go to maintenance. Another fraction is going to go to production. And that ratio of how much of that actually goes to production versus available for production is called the production efficiency. Again, the product of those three then tell you, or can be used to understand, the ratio of how much production you have at a level versus how much production is at a lower level. Figure 10.11 shows some of the basic differences between terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems in terms of biomass and energy flow. So for example, here's biomass for terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. For a terrestrial ecosystem, you can see that there's often a lot of biomass in the plants. These are referred to as primary producers. So plants, there's a lot of. There's a smaller fraction of herbivores and an even smaller fraction of primary carnivores and secondary carnivores. So you take a look at how much biomass is present in each of these trophic levels, and it forms a pyramid to a certain degree. If we take a look at an aquatic ecosystem, that pyramid appears to be inverted. We actually don't see a lot of plants in a lake, for example. If we were to take a look at how much phytoplankton is there, it actually is a lot less than how much fish is there, either primary carnivores or secondary carnivores. And again, herbivores tend to be different types of zooplankton, and primary carnivores are often other zooplankton or small fish, and then larger fish. But essentially, if we take a look at how much fish there is to how much plant, that ratio is a lot higher, and often there's more fish than there is plant in a lake. So why are these different between a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic ecosystem? Well, the biomass is often inverted in an aquatic ecosystem, but the energy flow is still what you would expect. So for example, if we take a look at plants, for a given amount of primary production, if we standardize that between two systems, that a lot greater fraction of the energy that's produced in plants goes to herbivores in aquatic systems than it does in terrestrial ecosystems. So this is no longer an inverted pyramid. You have a lot more energy flowing through plants than you do the amount of biomass that's there. The difference between the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems in part has to do with mean residence time. So the mean residence time of biomass in a system is relatively long for plants in a terrestrial ecosystem, but it's relatively fast for an aquatic ecosystem. So a given phytoplankton might only last a couple days as opposed to 3, 4, 5 months, if not years, for a terrestrial ecosystem. Because this pool turns over a lot more slowly, it's going to be a lot larger for a given amount of energy flow than in the aquatic ecosystem. Now the authors also show that there are other differences between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems in the sense that most plants in an aquatic system are relatively small compared to herbivores and then the carnivores. And as you go to larger and larger organisms, the generation time gets longer and longer. So low mean residence time, high mean residence time, which gives you a little bit more of a reason to have an inverted pyramid as far as biomass is concerned. These are turning over a lot faster, and these are turning over a lot slower in an aquatic ecosystem. In contrast, often, herbivores and carnivores tend to be a lot smaller than plants in system, and they overlap, for example. But if you think about a forest, that the material in a forest turns over a lot more slowly often than for herbivores and carnivores. So they're smaller and they have a faster generation time.